In June 1944, the skies over France were burning. While men fought on beaches below, the air above was its own battlefield, a place where skill, instinct, and horsepower decided who lived and who fell. He was just 21. Lieutenant Jack Warren, a Kansas farm boy who had grown up racing tractors down dirt roads, now sat in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, a roaring metal beast the size of a bus and twice as loud. It was his third mission, and already he'd lost 2 friends. Every time they tangled with the Germans, it ended the same way. The enemy outturned them, danced around them, and disappeared into the clouds. The P-47 was fast, strong, and tough, but it wasn't nimble. Against the sleek German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, it felt like trying to catch a swallow with a hammer. Jack had grown frustrated, angry. He was trained to fight, but every time he pulled back on the stick trying to twist and roll, the enemy simply cut inside and shot him down in his imagination before it happened in life. Then came the morning briefing. The squadron commander, a battle-worn ace named Hub Zemke, stood before the young pilots, calm, unshaken, his uniform stained with oil and sweat. He had seen every trick the Luftwaffe had to offer and had survived it all. Zemke didn't talk much about glory. He talked about survival and math. It's about physics, gravity, and horsepower. He told the boys, if you try to turn with a Messerschmitt, you'll die. If you fight like a Thunderbolt, you'll live. That was the day Jack learned the words that would save his life: boom and zoom. The strategy was simple and brutal. Climb higher than the enemy. Wait in the sun where they couldn't see you. Then dive, fast and straight, using the P-47's enormous weight and engine power. You didn't dogfight. You struck once, and then you were gone, climbing again before they could react. It wasn't about honor or fairness. It was about efficiency, about turning American engineering into a weapon the enemy couldn't match. The first time Jack tried it, his stomach lurched. He climbed until the clouds became white islands below him. His cockpit shook, oxygen mask tight, sweat running down his neck despite the freezing air. Below, tiny dots shimmered in the distance, German fighters hunting a formation of bombers. He heard his commander's voice crackle through the radio. "Now, Warren, dive and don't look back!" He pushed the stick forward. The Thunderbolt dropped like a falling star. Wind howled, metal groaned, the world blurred into streaks of blue and silver. His eyes watered from the sheer speed. In seconds, he was behind a FW-190, the same kind of plane that had humiliated him before. He fired a short burst. 8 .50 caliber machine guns spat fire. The rounds tore into the German's wing. A bloom of smoke, a flash of flame, and then nothing. The plane spiraled down, a black comet disappearing into the cloud layer. Jack didn't cheer, he didn't smile, he just pulled up, climbing again, heart pounding. It had worked. The boom and zoom wasn't a trick, it was a revelation. Over the next weeks, everything changed. The 56th Fighter Group, the Zemke S Wolfpack, became one of the deadliest air units in Europe. They stopped playing the Germans' game. They made their own. Every mission became a hunt, a measured surgical strike from above. They'd climb high over France or Germany, their thunderbolts shimmering in the sun, and then, one by one, they'd drop like thunderbolts themselves. Jack began to feel it, that strange, terrifying calm of mastery. He understood what Zemke meant when he said, "You're not fighting them anymore, you're executing them." By late summer, the Americans had air superiority. German aces still fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered, outpowered, and running out of fuel. Jack's squadron flew mission after mission, escorting bombers to Berlin, strafing convoys, and destroying airfields. Each time, he felt the same mix of awe and guilt. From above, it wasn't a battle, it was a turkey shoot. The term spread among pilots. Grim humor for an ugly truth. Their enemies couldn't climb fast enough, couldn't dive hard enough, couldn't hide from the sky's new predator, the P-47 Thunderbolt. On one mission, Jack saw a lone German plane limping home, smoke trailing behind it. He could have finished it easily. His guns were loaded, but something stopped him. The German pilot looked back through his shattered canopy, his face pale and expressionless. They locked eyes for a heartbeat. And in that moment, Jack realized the man wasn't his enemy anymore. He was just another pilot trying to get home. Jack pulled away. He didn't fire. He climbed back into the sun, leaving the burning plane to its fate. When the war ended in 1945, Jack returned home with medals, scars, and memories he didn't speak about. He went back to Kansas, to the same wide sky he'd grown up staring at. But now, when he looked up, he didn't see clouds or birds. He saw the shapes of thunderbolts falling from the sun, and the faces of men he never met but would never forget. Years later, old and grey, he would sit on his porch as the evening light faded. He'd hear the distant hum of a propeller, maybe from a passing crop duster, and it would take him back for a second, back to those frozen mornings over France, back to the roar of engines and the rush of air as he dove through the clouds. And he'd remember what the old commander had said: war isn't about who turns faster, it's about who learns faster. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful, but it was unstoppable. It wasn't elegant, but it was enduring. Just like the men who flew it. They weren't the fastest or the most skilled, but they were the ones who figured out how to win. And in the skies of 1944, that made all the difference. The air over the Russian steppe was cold enough to freeze the breath inside a man's lungs. But it wasn't men the Germans feared that night. It was women, flying biplanes made of wood and fabric. The Soviet Union called them the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The Germans gave them another name, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. They flew ancient Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, slow and fragile, open cockpit machines meant for training, not combat. No armor, no radio, no parachutes. Each carried 2 small bombs, that was all. But the women who flew them had something the enemy couldn't measure: courage sharpened by necessity. Every night after sunset, they took off from muddy airstrips lit by the faint glow of cigarettes and flashlights cupped in trembling hands. The planes coughed, sputtered, and lifted into the black sky. Engines barely strong enough to clear the treetops. They flew low, barely 500 feet above the ground, and to avoid detection by German radar. When they reached their targets, they'd cut their engines and glide silently through the night. Only the whisper of wind through the wings gave them away. And then 2 bombs dropped, explosions bloomed below, and they disappeared back into the darkness. The Germans said the sound of the gliding biplanes reminded them of broomsticks. That's why they called them witches. One of those pilots was Nadezhda Popova, barely 22 years old, who had already flown hundreds of missions. Her family home had been destroyed early in the war. Her brother had died fighting near Moscow. For her, flying wasn't glory. It was vengeance. Her uniform was patched and torn, her gloves stolen from a dead German soldier, her maps drawn by hand. The cockpit was so cold that frost formed on her eyelashes, and yet, night after night, she flew. The Night Witches had no instruments worth trusting. They navigated by rivers, by the shape of roads, by memory. When clouds hid the moon, they relied on instinct, on the faint glimmer of starlight and the feel of wind over their faces. They flew in teams of 3. The first plane would distract the searchlights. The second would draw anti-aircraft fire. The third would dive in silently and drop the bombs. It was a deadly dance, and many never came back. One night, Popova's plane was hit, Shrapnel tore through the fabric wings, bullets shattered the rear struts, and flames licked the fuselage. Her navigator screamed, "We're burning!" But Popova didn't jump. She kept flying, gliding low until they were over friendly territory. The engine coughed once more before dying completely, and they crashed into a field of snow. When she woke up, she saw the wreck of her plane and thought, "I'm alive. I can fly again." By dawn, she was already asking for another aircraft. By 1944, the Night Witches had become legends. They flew up to 18 missions in a single night, reloading by hand, flying again and again until dawn. Their faces were smeared with oil and dust, their eyes hollow from exhaustion, their hair frozen to their caps. They became a nightmare for the Germans. Even when they didn't drop bombs, their presence haunted enemy soldiers. The thought that death could come from the whisper of wings in the night. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Their planes were slow, so slow that German fighters often couldn't lock on to them. If a Messerschmitt tried to chase them, it risked stalling mid-air. That slowness, was that weakness, became their strength. They turned the impossible into an advantage. By the end of the war, the Night Witches had flown over 30,000 sorties and dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs. 30 of them were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Many others were buried in unmarked graves, their names remembered only by those who flew beside them. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Popova had flown 852 missions. She had been shot down several times, wounded, frozen, and nearly captured, but she never stopped flying. She once said, "It was the height of war, and every night was a fight between life and death. But I was young, I wanted to fly." After the war, she became a flight instructor. Her students never knew that the quiet woman who taught them to take off and land had once glided through anti-aircraft fire in a wooden biplane. She lived to see the Berlin Wall fall, the Soviet Union collapse, and her story finally told to the world. When she was an old woman, someone asked her if she ever felt fear. She smiled and said, "Of course, every night. But fear doesn't mean you stop. It just means you fly lower." The Night Witches of the 588th Regiment didn't have speed, power, or protection, but they had will. And the will to fight turned canvas wings into weapons. They proved that victory isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about persistence, about flying through the dark, again and again, until the dawn finally comes. The Pacific Ocean in June 1942 was endless blue, calm on the surface, hiding war beneath. The Japanese Navy stretched across the sea like a floating empire. 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, thousands of men. They had never been defeated. But on a small atoll called Midway, a handful of American pilots were waiting, undertrained, under-equipped, and unshakably determined. This was the battle that would change the course of the war. The Japanese plan was simple: lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap, destroy them, and crush American naval power forever. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, believed the Americans were still broken, but they weren't. Through a stroke of genius and luck, U.S. cryptanalysts had broken Japan's naval code. They knew exactly where and when the attack would come. For the first time in the war, America would meet Japan not as prey, but as hunter. On June 4th, before sunrise, waves shimmered under the faint glow of dawn. American pilots from Midway Island scrambled into their aircraft. Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters. Their engines coughed and roared, one after another, until the entire airstrip trembled. They were outnumbered, their planes outdated, but they carried something stronger than steel: desperation. They took off into the morning haze, heading toward a horizon filled with fire. From the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, More squadrons launched. Among them were men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Ensign George Gay. Ordinary young men thrown into extraordinary moments. They climbed high into the sky, scanning the endless ocean for the enemy. Hours passed, no sign. Fuel ran low, some turned back, but McCluskey didn't. He kept flying, trusting instinct and fate. Far below, another group, Torpedo, Squadron 8, had found the enemy first. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, they attacked head-on, straight into a wall of Japanese fighters. Their slow, outdated planes were slaughtered one by one. No escorts, no cover, just courage against impossible odds. Of the 15 planes that went in, 14 were shot down. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay. Floating in the ocean, wounded and surrounded by burning wreckage, he watched the rest of the battle unfold from the water. He saw the Japanese carriers, proud and confident, turning their decks to recover planes, and then, above them, he saw dark specks glinting in the sun. They were McCluskey's dive bombers. After flying far beyond their fuel limits, they had finally found the enemy, by sheer chance, following the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing through the waves. It led them straight to the heart of the Japanese fleet. McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a dive. The ocean spun upward and the blue sky became a blur. Bombs released, seconds of silence, then the world erupted. One by one, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu exploded into fireballs. Their decks were packed with fuel, planes, and ammunition. In minutes, 3 of Japan's mightiest warships were burning ruins. The surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, struck back with fury, launching 2 waves that crippled the USS Yorktown. But the Americans were relentless. Later that afternoon, more dauntless bombers found Hiryu and sent her to the bottom of the sea. By nightfall, 4 Japanese carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone. The pride of Japan's navy had been shattered. When the sun rose the next morning, the Pacific was strangely quiet. Only smoke and drifting wreckage remained, the ghosts of 2 great fleets. Ensign George Gay was rescued after 30 hours adrift, exhausted and half dead. He had watched the entire battle from the sea, the destruction of the Japanese carriers and the victory of his comrades. Out of his squadron, he was the only survivor. When reporters asked him later how he felt, he said softly, "I saw history happen in front of me. I just wish the others could have seen it too." The Battle of Midway lasted only a few days, but its impact was eternal. It stopped Japan's expansion cold and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. From that point on, the Empire of Japan would never again take the offensive. It was a turning point, built not on superior numbers, but on courage, timing, and sacrifice. Historians often call it a miracle, but for the men who fought there, it wasn't divine intervention. It was human will. Pilots who flew into near-suicidal missions, commanders who trusted instinct, and engineers who refused to give up. They turned a hopeless defense into a decisive victory. Years later, McCluskey received little recognition during his lifetime. But his leadership had saved the Pacific Fleet. In 2019, nearly 8 decades after the battle, the U.S. Navy posthumously awarded him the Navy Cross. His name joined the others, Waldron, Gay, Best, and countless men who had risked everything in those blue skies. The Battle of Midway proved something simple and eternal, that wars aren't won by numbers alone, they're won by moments, by decisions made in seconds, by courage that defies logic. It was the day ordinary men changed the direction of a world war. And when the ocean finally swallowed the last flames, the tide of history had already turned. Winter, 1904. Europe was frozen under the coldest snow in decades. The war was supposed to be almost over. The Allies had broken through Normandy and were pushing toward Germany. But then, in December, the German army struck back. It was called the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate surprise offensive meant to split the Allied lines and recapture the port of Antwerp. And in the middle of that storm stood one small Belgian town, Bastogne. Whoever held Bastogne would hold the key to the entire front. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been resting after months of combat. They were young, tired, and low on supplies when the call came. They were being sent to Bastogne. Fast. They loaded trucks, jeeps, and whatever they could carry. Many had no winter coats. Some didn't even have gloves. But they went anyway, because that's what they did. Among them was Private First Class Martin Keller, a 19-year-old from Ohio. He carried a letter in his pocket, folded neatly, sealed, but never sent. It was addressed to his mother. He had started writing it before the march, but never finished it. When the 101st arrived at Bastogne, the town was already surrounded by snow and confusion. German tanks were closing in from every direction. Within days, the division was completely encircled. No supplies, no reinforcements, no escape. The men dug into foxholes, using their helmets to scoop out frozen dirt. They wrapped their feet in rags to fight frostbite. They burned wooden crates to stay alive. Snow fell, then froze, then fell again. Every sound echoed, every breath hung in the air. They called it the Siege of Bastogne. German loudspeakers taunted them day and night. "Americans, you are surrounded! Surrender now and you will live!" But no one surrendered. They waited, hungry, cold, and outnumbered, for help that might never come. On December 22nd, a German delegation arrived under a white flag. They brought a letter demanding the Americans surrender immediately, promising complete annihilation if they didn't. The note was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. He read it once, smiled faintly, and said a single word, "nuts." That one word became legend. The written reply, officially delivered to the Germans, read, "To the German commander, nuts." When the messenger returned confused, the American officer explained, "It means go to hell." But hell was already there. The bombardments were constant. Shells screamed over the snow, lighting up the night like brief flashes of daylight. Private Keller and his squad huddled together in a foxhole. He had stopped feeling his toes days ago. The rations were frozen solid, even the chocolate bars. Sometimes, in the silence between artillery, Keller would take out that unfinished letter. He'd read the last line he'd written. "Don't worry, Mum, I'll be home for Christmas." Then he'd tuck it back into his jacket and stare at the endless snow. Christmas came, December 25th, 1944. The men sang softly, off-key, around small fires hidden from German sight. They shared stories, laughed weakly, and pretended not to be afraid. In the distance, they could hear engines, American bombers flying overhead, dropping supplies in parachutes. One of those crates landed near Keller's foxhole. Inside were blankets, medicine, and a few tins of hot cocoa powder. For the first time in weeks, they felt human again. Days later, the rumble of tanks grew louder, but these weren't German. It was General Patton's Third Army breaking through the snow from the south. When the first American tank rolled into Bastogne, the soldiers cried, laughed, and shouted. They had survived the siege. After 7 days of cold, hunger, and endless shelling, Bastogne was finally relieved. Private Keller never made it home, though. He was killed the next morning, struck by a sniper while helping to pull a wounded man out of the street. When medics found his body, they discovered that letter still in his pocket, now blood-stained, but dry inside. They mailed it home. His mother received it in February 1945. The envelope was bent, the ink faded, but she could still read his last words. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll be home for Christmas." Bastogne became one of the most famous stands of the war, a symbol of defiance, endurance, and the will to fight when all logic says you shouldn't. The 101st Airborne, those cold, starving men, had held the line against the German panzer divisions. They didn't just defend a town, they defended hope. When the war ended months later, Europe was in ruins. But the world remembered Bastogne. The men who fought there said they weren't heroes. They were just doing their job. But history tells it differently, because sometimes heroism isn't about charging forward. It's about holding on, one frozen night at a time. And somewhere in the snow, a letter still whispers through the wind. June 6th, 1944, the night before D-Day. A storm rolled over the English Channel, cold, black, and endless. Hundreds of planes filled the sky, their engines humming like distant thunder. But hidden among them were strange, quiet shapes. Wooden aircraft with no engines at all. They were gliders, and the men who flew them were the silent wings of the invasion. Their mission was simple and suicidal, and to land behind enemy lines in total darkness, carrying troops, jeeps, and even artillery, all inside flimsy, unarmed aircraft made of plywood and canvas. They couldn't turn back. They couldn't climb. Once they were released from the tow planes, they were committed, flying on faith, gravity, and luck. One of those men was Lieutenant James "Jimmy" McGraw, a 24-year-old glider pilot from Texas. He had joined the Army Air Forces dreaming of becoming a fighter pilot. Instead, he ended up flying what soldiers called flying coffins. He never complained. He said quietly, "If we don't go, no one else can land the men who fight." That night, Jimmy's Waco CG-4A glider was packed tight. 2 jeeps, supplies, and 13 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne. The tow rope connected them to a C-47 transport plane ahead, its engines roaring through the night. The pilots exchanged a quick nod. Then at 2:30 a.m., the gliders lifted into the storm. Over the dark channel, lightning flashed, revealing hundreds of planes stretching to the horizon. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the French coast, red and green tracers streaking upward. Jimmy gripped the controls tighter, his face lit by the brief glow of flak bursts. One shell exploded close, rocking the glider violently. The paratroopers behind him crossed themselves and prayed. Nobody spoke. Finally, over the drop zone near Sainte-Mère-Église, the tow plane pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Release! Good luck, boys!" Jimmy pulled the lever. The tow rope snapped away, and suddenly there was silence. No engine, no roar, just the sound of wind rushing past the cockpit. The world became calm, eerily calm, as the glider drifted down through the moonlight. Below they could see the faint outline of fields and hedgerows. But the Germans were ready. Searchlights swept the sky, and tracer fire arced upward. Jimmy banked hard, trying to avoid a burst of flak. The glider lurched, the wings groaning. He could smell burning wood. They'd been hit. He shouted back, "Hold on!" The ground rushed up faster than it should have. He fought the stick, leveling the nose just in time. With a thunderous crash, the glider slammed into a field, skidding through the mud and smashing through a stone wall before coming to rest. Silence again. Then groans. But they were alive. The men tumbled out, dazed but breathing. The jeeps were battered but usable. Within minutes, the paratroopers loaded up and disappeared into the hedgerows to join the fight. Jimmy stayed behind with his co-pilot, checking for wounded and trying to salvage the radio. They could hear gunfire all around. The invasion had begun. By dawn, the horizon was filled with parachutes, smoke, and flashes of battle. D-Day was underway. In the chaos, gliders had landed scattered across the countryside, in fields, trees, even ponds. Many pilots died on impact. Some were captured, but thousands of men and tons of equipment had made it to the ground exactly where they were needed, because of those silent pilots. Their precision allowed airborne troops to seize bridges, block German reinforcements, and secure the flanks for the beach landings. Without them, the invasion could have failed before it began. Jimmy and his co-pilot were later found by friendly forces 2 days after the landing. They were cold, hungry, and exhausted, but they'd completed their mission. When an officer asked if he was ready to go back to England, Jimmy looked out at the smoking horizon and said, "Not until every man I dropped gets home first." The glider pilots weren't glamorous. They weren't remembered like fighter aces or generals. They had no armor, no guns, and no second chances. But they were the first to land in occupied France, and many never took off again. Out of roughly 6,000 American glider pilots who flew in Europe, nearly 40% were killed, wounded, or captured. Yet every single one of them volunteered. After the war, Jimmy returned home to Texas. He never bragged about his service. When asked about it years later, he smiled and said, "We just aimed for the dark and hoped we hit France." Today, most people don't remember the gliders. They remember the paratroopers, the tanks, the beaches. But behind every success at Normandy were men who flew without engines, without guns, and without fear, carrying soldiers to the front lines in silence. They were the first to arrive and the last to leave. They didn't soar to glory. They fell to it.